He had everything the world said mattered. An empire worth $3 billion. A penthouse that touched the clouds. A name that opened every door in every city on earth. But the one door he couldn't open was the one that led back to his wife's eyes. 4 years, 17 specialists, 9 surgeries, stem cell trials, experimental treatments flown in from 4 continents. Nothing she would never see again. That's what every doctor told Ethan Black. And then she arrived. A nanny with no past, no references, and no explanation for what she was about to do. What Ethan caught her doing in the dead of night changed every single thing he thought he knew. To understand what happened, kindly hit the subscribe button and ensure you follow us till the end. The night Ethan Black stopped sleeping, he was sitting in a chair that cost more than most people's cars, in an apartment that sat above the clouds, listening to his wife cry through a wall he didn't know how to cross. She thought he couldn't hear her. That was the thing about Lila. She had always been careful with her pain. She kept it folded small, tucked away, presented the world with a version of herself that was coping, that was managing, that was fine. 4 years of blindness, and she had never once screamed about it, never thrown anything, never turned to him with the full weight of what had been taken from her and laid it at his feet where it belonged. He almost wished she would. The guilt would have been easier to carry if she'd handed it to him directly, instead of quietly absorbing it herself, protecting him from it, the way she protected him from everything. As though he were the fragile one, as though he hadn't been the one on the phone, as though his hands hadn't been on the wheel. He reached over and turned off the desk lamp. 40 floors below, the city breathed its low, indifferent roar. He sat in the dark and listened to it, and listened to the silence behind it, and thought about a Tuesday in November 4 years ago that had lasted in one form or another every single day since. $3 billion. That was the number the magazines liked to print next to his name. 3 billion, and the penthouse to prove it, and the private jet, and the board seats, and the door that opened in every city on earth the moment someone said Ethan Black is here. He had built all of it with his own hands, his own mind, his own relentless refusal to accept the word no from anyone about anything. And then, life had handed him something he couldn't negotiate with, something that didn't care about his money or his name or the devastating, exhausting force of his will, his wife's eyes. 17 specialists, 9 surgeries, stem cell trials in 3 countries, an experimental procedure in Singapore performed by a surgeon so talented she'd been compared to a young Barnard who had worked on 2 of her 3 previous patients and done absolutely nothing for Lila. A research program in Zurich that Ethan had personally funded to the tune of $4 million, which had produced a breakthrough for the broader field of neuro-ophthalmology and 0 results for the woman sitting in the room down the hall. Every doctor had eventually said the same thing, in whatever language they spoke it, with whatever variation of gentle regret they'd been trained to perform. Irreversible. He had stopped telling Lila about new treatments 8 months ago, not because he'd given up. He would go to his grave not having given up, but because he had watched something happen to her face each time a treatment failed. A small, private collapse behind her eyes, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. Each new hope, followed by its ending, had cost her something, and she had less left to spend, so he'd stopped telling her, and she had stopped asking. And they had arrived, quietly and without announcement, at a kind of grief that had no name, because it wasn't the grief of losing someone. It was the grief of watching someone disappear while standing right in front of you, while holding their hand. While saying "I love you" over breakfast in an apartment full of morning light she couldn't to see. He sat in the dark until the city below began its thin pre-dawn lightning. Then he picked up his phone. "Find me someone," he said when his assistant answered, because she always answered. And that was the one reliable thing about his life. Not a doctor, not a specialist. Someone tobe with her. Someone who can actually. He stopped, pressed his fingers to his eyes, started again. "Just find me someone good." He didn't say because I'm losing her. He didn't say because the woman I married is disappearing one quiet night at a time, and I don't know how to reach her anymore. He didn't say any of the true things, He just said, "Tonight. Don't wait until morning," and hung up. He had met Lila in a room full of paintings on a Thursday in October, and he had not been looking for her, which was perhaps why he found her. He was supposed to be somewhere else. He was always supposed to be somewhere else in those years, perpetually in motion between one obligation and the next, never quite landing long enough to become part of anything. The gallery was in the lobby of the same building as a dinner he was already late for. His car was circling. He had 12 minutes to kill and walked in without intention. The paintings stopped him before she did. They were large, most of them, dangerously large, the kind of scale that announces a painter who is not interested in being ignored. And the color in them was almost confrontational, so precise and so unexpected that standing in front of one felt less like looking at art and more like being caught not paying attention to something you'd been walking past your whole life. He stopped in front of a canvas in the back corner. Winter light through a window, but the light rendered in what looked like 20 different colors, golds and silvers, and one shade of blue-gray that he had no name for, that he had never seen anywhere, that he immediately understood was the precise color of early morning in February, and always had been, even though he had never once noticed. That one almost didn't make it in. He turned. She was standing slightly behind him, his head tilted, looking at her own painting with an expression of concentrated reassessment. There was cadmium yellow on her left wrist, a streak she hadn't noticed, or had noticed and decided not to care about. She was not looking at him. "I thought it was too quiet," she said. "Too small a thing to show people." "It's not small," he said. She looked at him then, considered him. "No," she agreed. "I decided that last week. I change my mind about it every few months. It's very rude of it." She held out her hand. "Lila Crane. I painted everything in here." He said his name. She didn't react to it. In his entire professional life, no one had ever not reacted to it, and the absence of reaction was so disorienting that he forgot the dinner completely and stood there for 3 hours instead, listening to her talk about color and light and the thing that happens to a room at 6 o'clock in winter, the particular loneliness of it, the way most people close the blinds right at the moment the light is doing its most interesting work. At the end of the evening, someone interrupted to congratulate Mr. Black with all the reverence the name apparently deserved, and Lila looked at him with a slow, delighted smile. "You could have told me you were famous and miss watching you explain impasto to a billionaire for 40 minutes, he said. "I would never—" She laughed, and it was the laugh that undid him. Not performed, not careful, just completely recklessly real. He was gone before the sound of it finished. They were married 18 months later, and happy for 5 years in the way that people are happy when they have accidentally found the right person and are wise enough to know it. Not the performed happiness of people trying to convince each other, but the quiet, durable kind that shows up in ordinary mornings, in the particular ease of being known. Then came November. Wet road. A deal worth $80 million. A call Ethan decided couldn't wait the 30 more minutes it would have taken to get home safely. He was talking. He was not watching the curve. The other car came fast and low, and the impact was a sound he would hear in the back of his skull for the rest of his life. Lila survived. Her eyes did not. Both optic nerves, catastrophic bilateral trauma, permanent damage. Every specialist agreed, across every language, in every city he could reach. "We're so sorry, Mr. Black. We're so sorry." He stopped hearing anything after irreversible. The word dropped into him like a stone into still water, and the ripples were still moving, 4 years later, slow and cold and endless. She never blamed him. That was the thing he could not figure out how to live with. She never said the words they both knew, never pointed at him with the full truth of what his distraction had stolen from her. She just carried it, quietly, the way she carried everything, and the quietness of it was somehow worse than accusation, because it left him alone with what he knew, unable to confess to someone who had already forgiven him for something he would never forgive himself for. He spent 4 years trying to buy back what he'd taken. The world's best couldn't give it back. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, hand-delivered to his building's front desk. No agency, no referral, no email chain, no LinkedIn request, no professional courtesy of any kind. just cream-colored paper addressed to him personally in handwriting that was careful and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who was not worried about being ignored. One page, a name, Alara Voss, a request to be considered as a live-in companion for his wife, an acknowledgement that there had been no posting, no opening, no advertised position. She had simply heard of Lila's situation through sources she preferred not to detail in writing. And then the last line, which was the line he kept coming back to, "I believe I can help your wife in ways that current medicine cannot. I ask only for the opportunity to try." He stared at that line for a long time. Every rational instinct he possessed said, file it. Every experience he had with people who made promises about helping Lila told him this was either delusion or a con. He had been approached before by miracle workers and faith healers and alternative practitioners of every stripe, drawn to his wife's story and his money with the same frequency and the same outcome. Nothing. He called his assistant. "Get her on the phone," he said. Today, she arrived Thursday morning with one bag and the kind of stillness that fills a room without asking permission. She was younger than he expected, mid-30s maybe, though something in her eyes, steady, unhurried, carrying more weight than they should at that age, suggested she had lived a great deal beyond her years. She shook his hand with the brief, firm confidence of someone who has never needed to perform confidence, and then looked past him down the hallway. "May I meet her?" No small talk, no resume, no pitch. Just that. May I meet her? As though meeting Lila were the only thing that mattered, and everything else, including him, was geography. He stepped aside. Lila was in the sitting room, already oriented toward the doorway before Alara reached it. She had become extraordinary with sound in the years since the accident, could read footsteps the way musicians read notation, different weights, different tempos, different intentions. She had already formed an impression before the woman spoke. "Hello," Lila said. "Hello, Lila." Ethan would think about those two words later, when he had more reason to. The way she said the name specifically. Not Mrs. Black, not the careful neutrality of someone meeting a stranger. Something closer. Something that landed with the weight of recognition. Lila tilted her head. That small, precise movement she made when something caught her attention and she was deciding what to do with it. "You sound," she said slowly, "like someone who's been looking forward to this." A beat of silence. And then, quietly, almost privately, as though she hadn't meant to say it out loud, "I have been. For a very long time." Ethan watched his wife's face. She was smiling, not politely. Not the careful, functional smile she had learned to produce for doctors and visitors in the years since the accident. A smile that was kind, but lived only on the surface of her, behind which he could always see the vast, quiet sadness she was managing. This was different. This was the smile he recognized, the real one, the unguarded one. He had not seen it in 8 months. He hired Alara before the afternoon was over. He told himself it was desperation. He didn't yet understand that what he was watching begin in his sitting room was something that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about what was possible. That night, passing the sitting room on the way to his office, he slowed. Ilara's voice was low and unhurried, threading through the half-open door. A story she was telling, something old, something quiet, and then a shift in her tone, something lower still, something that wasn't meant to carry. He stopped. "I can bring the light back, Lila." A pause. "But only if you trust me completely." Ethan stood in the hallway, with his hand flat against the wall, and felt something move in his chest that he had long since stopped expecting to feel. Something that felt dangerously like the first edge of hope. The first thing Alara changed was the kitchen, and she did it so quietly that it took Ethan 3 days to notice. No overhaul, no dramatic reorganization, just small additions, appearing one by one on the shelves like they had always been there. Small glass jars with handwritten labels, a dark honey that came in an unmarked jar with a Slovenian postmark, a stone mortar she'd brought in her single bag that sat on the counter each morning with a faint herbal residue in it, evidence of grinding that had happened before the rest of the house was awake. The tea she made for Lila each morning didn't smell like any tea he recognized. It smelled like something older, something that belonged to a different century, a different understanding of what the body was and what it needed. He had it tested on the 4th day, discreetly, sent a sample to a private lab through his assistant, saying nothing to Alara and nothing to Lila. The results came back within 48 hours and told him everything and nothing simultaneously. Every compound was natural, nothing remotely toxic, nothing any conventional physician would look at twice. But the combination, the specific plants, the ratios, the method of preparation, didn't match anything in any database his team could find. Not in Chinese herbal medicine, not in Ayurvedic tradition, and not in any European folk remedy catalog his team could locate. It was its own thing entirely. He stared at the lab report for a long time. Then he filed it and said nothing. The sessions in the garden began on the 5th morning. Ethan watched the first one from the kitchen window, coffee in hand, with the studied casualness of a man pretending not to surveil his own rooftop. He needn't have bothered. Neither of them was paying the slightest attention to him. The rooftop garden had been Lila's project in the first year of their marriage, before the accident. She had planned it herself, chosen every plant with the deliberateness she brought to everything visual, this color next to that one, this texture against that, the whole thing designed to be looked at. In the 2 years before Alara arrived, she hadn't been up there at all. He hadn't pushed it. It seemed cruel, somehow, to bring her to a garden she'd built around the experience of seeing. Alara had simply taken her hand one morning after breakfast and said, "Let's go outside." No preamble, no therapeutic framing, just, "Let's go outside," the way someone says it to a person they're certain will want to once they're there. They walked slowly, Alara guiding Lila not by the arm the way every previous caregiver had done, the careful, arm-linked escort of someone managing a limitation, but with 2 fingers at Lila's wrist. A lighter contact, more responsive, the difference between being steered and being accompanied. And as they walked, Alara talked. Not the way sighted people describe things to blind people, cataloging shapes and dimensions and colors as foreign data, information about a world the listener can't access. She described the garden the way Lila used to see it, in the language Lila had spent her whole life developing. "The rose on your left," Alara said, and her voice carried down to him through the morning air, "isn't red. It's the color of wanting something you almost had. Right at the edge of red pulling back." A pause. Then Lila's voice, surprised and soft. "That's ochre burgundy. I used it in a painting once. I called it color of almost—" "I know," Alara said. "I've seen it." Even from the kitchen window, Ethan saw Lila turn her head, the small, precise movement she made when something caught her. "You've seen my paintings?" A beat. Something in the quality of the silence before Alara answered. "A long time ago," she said, "before everything changed." She was infuriating to interrogate. That was the word he kept landing on. Not dishonest. He didn't think she was lying to him exactly, or at least he couldn't prove it, which was its own particular frustration for a man who had built a career on being able to read people. She answered every question he asked, directly and without visible discomfort. She just answered the minimum version of each question, giving him exactly enough to stop pressing, while leaving a door cracked behind her that he could see through, but not enter. He tried 3 times in the first 2 weeks. "Where did you train?" he asked on the 5th day, passing her in the kitchen. "With my father, primarily. He was a physician." She didn't look up from the mortar. "And I completed part of a formal medical program in Prague before I left." "Why did you leave?" "I decided I could learn more outside it than inside." "What does that mean?" "It means formal programs are designed to teach consensus. I was more interested in the edges." He tried again on the 9th day, in the garden more directly. "I need to understand what you're doing for my wife." "Of course." She was tending the dark-leafed plant she'd added to the trellis without asking, something he still hadn't identified. "I work with targeted pressure point activation, specific herbal compounds, and guided sensory recalibration. The goal is to rebuild neural pathways that have been dormant rather than destroyed. The optic nerve damage is structural, anatomical. You can't rebuild a destroyed nerve with finger pressure and tea." She looked at him then, something level and patient in her eyes. "No," she said, "you can't." "Then what exactly, Mr. Black?" She said it gently, which was somehow more stopping than if she'd said it sharply. "How is your wife this week, compared to the week before I arrived?" He said nothing. "I'll continue then," she said, and went back to the plant. The third background check came back the same as the first two. His investigator, a former intelligence analyst who charged accordingly and had never once failed to find what Ethan needed him to find, called on a Tuesday morning with the particular tone of a professional embarrassed by his own results. "There's a birth record," he said. "Slovenia, 1989. A partial enrollment in a medical training program at Charles University in Prague. She attended for 2 years and left without completing." After that, a pause that communicated more than words would. "Nothing I can verify. No financial records, no property, no digital footprint of any kind. She either lived entirely off the grid, in communities that don't generate paper trails, or she was very deliberate about not being found. Which do you think it is?" A longer pause. "Honestly, I think it's both." Ethan ended the call and sat with that for a while. A woman who was either completely unremarkable or impossibly careful. Neither option was comforting. But the lack of red flags was its own kind of data. His investigator found things. That was the point of him. The fact that there was nothing to find meant either that Alara Voss was exactly what she appeared to be, quiet, skilled, private, or that she was something else entirely, something so carefully constructed that not even a former intelligence analyst could locate the seams. He should have asked her to leave. He looked at the closed door of his wife's studio, behind which he could hear, for the first time in 3 years, the specific silence of Lila thinking about a painting. Not the flat, heavy silence of depression. The alive silence of a mind at work. He went back to his office. He said nothing. 11 days after Alara arrived, something happened that Ethan wouldn't learn about until much later. Lila was alone in the sitting room in the late morning. The apartment quiet. Alara having gone out briefly to source something she needed from a specialist shop across the city. Lila was doing what she often did in quiet moments, holding objects, running her hands over them, memorizing the world through her palm since her eyes had been taken from her. She picked up the small ceramic bird from the side table, blue, vivid, a wedding gift from her closest friend Mara. She knew it by touch so well she could have drawn it blind, had in fact drawn it blind once in the early months when she was still trying to hold on to visual art as something that belonged to her. She ran her fingers along the wing, the beak, the round, smooth head, and then she froze. It lasted less than a second, a smear of color at the outermost edge of her field of vision. Not vision, what she had wasn't vision, it was something thinner and less reliable than that. A watercolor wash of blue, bleeding at the edges, gone before she could turn toward it. She sat very still. Her hand was trembling. She set the bird down with great care, as though it were responsible for what had just happened and might do it again if startled. She folded her hands in her lap. She stared straight ahead at the nothing she always stared at. She said nothing to anyone. Not to Ethan. Not to Alara when she returned an hour later, moving through the apartment with her particular quiet efficiency, something new in one of her jars. Lila said nothing because she had learned, across 4 years and 17 specialists and 9 surgeries and every treatment her husband's money could reach, exactly what hope cost when it didn't deliver. She knew the price of it, the specific, devastating way the body falls when it has let itself rise. She was not ready to fall again, so she filed it away, in the private archive of herself where she kept the things that were too important and too fragile to share, and she waited. She began keeping a list in her mind. The way blind people memorize things they cannot write down, rehearsing the information, anchoring it to other memories, building a structure for it in the dark. Day 12, a smear of gold from the evening sun through the west window, gone in under a second. Day 15, the rough rectangle of the garden doorway, dark gray against lighter gray. 2 seconds, maybe 3, then nothing. Day 19, Alara's hands during the evening pressure point session, her pale fingers visible for a full 4 seconds, the longest yet, before the darkness closed back in. She told no one, but she began to move through the apartment differently, subtly, carefully in ways she hoped no one would notice, testing, calibrating, cross-referencing what her hands told her against the faint, unreliable flickers her ruined eyes were producing. She was mapping the gap between what she felt and what she was beginning, against everything she'd been told was possible, to see. Ilara, meanwhile, was watching everything. She watched Lila move. She watched the quality of her attention during sessions, the way her breathing changed when a pressure point connected, the slight flicker of her eyelids at specific moments that corresponded to moments in the treatment Ilara's father's journals had marked with small red asterisks, and the notation response indicates pathway activity. She observed quietly, made her notes, and said nothing to either of them, but later, in the privacy of her room, she wrote, Ethan had passed her door twice in the late evening, and both times seen the light under it, the evidence of Ilara still awake, still working, when the rest of the apartment had gone to sleep. Once, passing more slowly, he heard the soft sound of pages turning, old pages, from the sound of it, paper that had been handled many times. On a Thursday evening, coming home later than usual, and moving quietly through the dark apartment, he passed her door and it was slightly open. He didn't mean to look, but the angle was such that he could see the corner of her desk, the worn leather journal lying open, and beside it what appeared to be another journal, older, its spine cracked with use, and a spread of papers covered in dense notation. Chemical formulas, he thought, though he'd never been a chemist. And something else. A sketch. He only had a second before he'd moved past the angle of vision. But the sketch was of a face, Lila's face, drawn with the detail of someone who had looked at it many times before. He stopped in the hallway, stood there for a long moment in the dark. Then he went to his office, closed the door, and sat behind his desk staring at nothing until 2 in the morning. On the 21st day, he overheard the phone call. He was walking down the hall toward Lila's old studio. She had been spending time in there again, though not painting, he thought, just existing in the space that had once been hers, which already felt like progress, when he heard her voice through the door. It was low, rapid, and tinged with something he hadn't heard in it for a long time. Excitement. He stopped. He knew he should keep walking. He did not keep walking. I'm seeing things, Mara. Her voice, hushed, urgent, bright with barely contained feeling. I know exactly how that sounds. I know. But I'm telling you, shapes. Light. I can see Ilara's hands when she's working on me. I can see the window in the morning. It's not clear. It's like someone put wax paper over everything, but Mara. It's something. It's there. A pause. Her friend's voice inaudible to him. I haven't told Ethan. A shift in her tone. Softer, more complicated. I can't. If I tell him and it stops, if I let him hope and then it... She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. Ilara says there's a final step. A real treatment. She says it has to happen on the full moon. I know how that sounds. And she says there's a risk. That it could overwhelm my system. That if it fails it could close off what we've built. A breath. I'm scared, Mara. I'm genuinely scared. But I'm also more alive than I've been in 4 years and I don't know what to do with that. Ethan's hand found the wall. He doesn't know any of it yet, Lila said. He stood in the hallway completely still while something moved through him that had no clean name. Not quite hope, not quite terror, not quite grief. Some compound emotion built from all three, running through him like current. He could hear everything, in her voice that she had been carrying alone. All of it. The flickers she'd been secretly cataloging. The careful, agonizing hope she'd been protecting him from so he wouldn't have to feel its weight unless it became certain. His wife had been carrying hope alone for weeks so he wouldn't have to. He stepped back from the door, quietly, carefully. The way you move away from something that isn't yours to witness, even if you love it with everything you have. He went to his office and sat in the dark. The full moon was 18 days away. The 18 days passed the way time passes when you're afraid of what's coming, agonizingly slow, and then suddenly gone. Ethan watched Ilara the way he watched everything that mattered to him. Quietly, from a careful distance, looking for the thing underneath the thing. It was the skill that had made him $3 billion and it was useless here, because Ilara gave him nothing. She was consistent, calm, impossible to rattle. She answered every question he asked with the minimum version of the truth, enough to stop him pressing, not enough to actually explain anything. She made her strange dark tea each morning, with a stone mortar she'd brought in her single bag. She tended the dark-leafed plant on the trellis, like it owed her something. She sat with Lila for hours in the evenings with her hands placed at precise points on Lila's temples, her eyes closed, her lips sometimes moving in something too quiet to catch. He had the tea tested again. Same result, natural, harmless, unidentifiable. He had his investigator make a fourth pass on her background. The man called back with the tone of someone ashamed of his own findings. Nothing. A birth record in Slovenia. 2 years of medical school in Prague abandoned. After that, air. 4 background checks. 4 walls of nothing. He should have ended it there. He looked at Lila, eating again, laughing again, moving through the apartment with a confidence. She was clearly trying to hide and hiding badly. And he filed the report and said nothing. On the 15th day before the full moon, he heard the phone call. He was passing Lila's old studio when her voice came through the door, low and rapid and lit with something he hadn't heard in it for years. He stopped before he could stop himself. "I'm seeing things, Mara," a hushed urgency in it, the voice of someone holding something too large for their hands, shapes, light. "I can see Alara's hands when she works on me. I know how it sounds, I know, but it's there." He put his hand against the wall. "I haven't told Ethan. Softer now, more complicated. If I tell him and it stops, if I let him hope and then—" She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. "Ilara says there's a final step, a real treatment. She says it has to happen on the full moon, and she says there's a risk, that it could close everything off if it fails. A breath. I'm terrified, Mara, but I'm more alive right now than I've been in 4 years, and I don't know what to do with that." He stood in the hallway for a long time. His wife had been carrying hope alone for weeks, protecting him from it, holding it carefully in the dark, so he wouldn't have to feel its weight unless it became real. He stepped back from the door, quietly, completely. He went to his office and sat in the dark and felt the specific terrible tenderness of loving someone who protects you from the things that would break you, even when they're breaking too. The full moon was 18 days away. He was not going to interfere. He told himself this repeatedly, firmly, all the way until 2:30 in the morning on the night it arrived. He saw the light under the sitting room door and was on his feet before he'd made a conscious decision to stand. Candlelight, warm, shifting, alive, moving in the gap at the base of the door like something breathing. He stood outside it with his hand flat against the wood. Through it, a voice, low, rhythmic, moving in a pattern that wasn't quite language and wasn't quite music. And beneath it, Lila's breathing, slower than normal, deeper, the breathing of someone in a state he couldn't name. He pushed the door open. The furniture had been cleared, the rug rolled back. Moonlight fell through the tall windows in broad silver panels across the bare floor, and 12 candles burned within it, placed in a careful, deliberate geometry that belonged to a system he had no access to. Lila sat at the center. Not slumped, not tense, held, the way people are held by total chosen stillness. Her face tilted upward, hands open on her thighs, her expression one of absolute calm. She looked like herself, the version of herself from before any of this, complete, present, unguarded. And Ilara knelt before her. Her palms were coated in the luminescent compound from her jars, catching the candlelight, holding it, something golden and alive, and those palms were pressed against Lila's closed eyes. Her lips moved in the low rhythmic pattern he'd heard through the door. Not random sounds. Something structured. Something that meant things he didn't have the language for. The air was different, not mystically different. He didn't use words like that. Physically different, compressed, charged. The atmospheric pressure of the seconds before a storm when the sky has already decided what it's going to do and the world below is still catching up. Then Lila's body tensed. Not a seizure. Something interior. Something large moving through a space almost large enough to contain it. Her fingers gripped the chair arms. Her breath came fast and fractured. Ilara's voice tightened in response, her hands pressing with a controlled force he could see in every muscle of her arms and shoulders. Lila made a sound. He couldn't describe it then, and he never could afterward. It wasn't pain, and it wasn't joy, and it wasn't language. It was the sound of something that has been shut for a very long time, released, and he was through the door. Stop. His voice came out raw, too large, stripped of everything but the fear underneath it. Get away from her. "What are you doing to my wife?" Ilara's hands dropped. She turned to him. Her face was ashen, emptied, not guilty, not afraid of him, just spent, in the way of someone who has poured everything they had into a single irreversible act. Silence. The candles burned. The moonlight fell, and Lila opened her eyes. She didn't open them slowly. They opened the way a door opens when someone on the other side finally gets the lock to turn. Sudden, complete, decisive. And she saw. He watched it happen, watched her eyes move across the candlelight, the moonlight on the floor, her own hands, the room she had not seen in 4 years. And her face did something he had no word for. Not joy, something that lives before joy, in the place where the body collides with something it had stopped believing would ever come back. Her eyes found him. They focused. Not the slight miscalibration of the past 4 years. Not aimed at sound instead of sight. Not the heartbreaking approximate direction he had spent years pretending not to notice. They found him, his face, specifically, completely, unmistakably. She looked at him, at the gray in his hair she didn't know was there, at the lines around his eyes he'd never described to her, at the expression on his face which he knew was completely undone. Nothing managed, nothing held back. 4 years of everything he'd been carrying visible all at once. Ethan. His name. From her mouth, but heavier than it had ever been. Loaded with sight, with him finally, actually seen. "I can see you." A pause. Her voice broke and then steadied and then broke again. "I can see everything." 4 steps. He counted them afterward. The distance between the doorway and his wife. 4 steps for 4 years. He dropped to his knees in front of her. She took his face in her hands and he took hers, and she looked at him, the full, close, searching reality of him. And he watched her take in every detail he had never been able to give her in words. She laughed. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears, expected anything but the clear, startled laugh that came out of her as she looked at his face. The laugh of someone arriving somewhere and finding it better and stranger and more real than they'd imagined. "You look terrible," she said. Something broke open in his chest. Whatever came out of it had no dignity and didn't need any. He pressed his forehead against hers. She held his face in both hands and he felt her thumbs moving under his eyes the way she always had. The gesture that meant to see you. "I have always seen you." Behind them, Ilara was quietly coming apart. He heard her before he saw it, the soft collapse of someone whose body has finally been allowed to stop. Lila heard it too. She was already turning, already moving toward her. Steadier on her feet than she'd been in years. And she caught Ilara before she reached the floor. Both arms around her, both of them down on the bare wood, Ilara's head against Lila's shoulder, Lila's hand in her hair, holding her the way you hold someone when words are inadequate and presence is everything. "I've got you," Lila said, still crying. "Completely certain. You did it. I've got you." Ilara, barely conscious, managed one thing. "Is it clear?" Lila looked at her face. At the exhaustion carved into it. At the scar on her forearm, visible where her sleeve had fallen back. Old, deliberate, running wrist to elbow. She looked at the scar, then back at Ilara's face, and understood, in the wordless way that certain truths arrive, that the story of how this woman came to be kneeling on her floor in the middle of the night was longer and older and more costly than she had known. "Perfect," she said quietly. "It's perfect." And Ilara, who had spent 9 years working toward this single moment, made a sound that was completely undignified and entirely human. The sound of a debt, finally, at tremendous cost, paid. The candles burned low around them. The moon moved west, and the city went on below, enormous, indifferent, alive, while the 3 of them stayed on the floor of that silver-lit room until the first thin line of dawn came up at the edge of the sky. New light, after a very long dark. She slept for 14 hours. Ethan checked on her twice, standing in the doorway, watching her breathe, feeling the strange tenderness of watching someone who had just emptied themselves completely finally be still. On his second visit he straightened her blanket without knowing why. It just felt necessary. Lila could not stop looking at things. She stood at the kitchen window for 40 minutes watching pigeons. She sat on the floor of her studio looking at her old paintings with an expression too private to read. She walked every room slowly, touching nothing, just looking, filling herself with the world she'd been locked out of. At one point she stopped at a photograph in the hallway, the two of them in Tuscany, squinting into the sun, the particular joy of people who don't know yet what's coming. She looked at it a long time. "I forgot what your smile looked like," she said quietly. "I remembered it wrong." She touched the frame. "It's better than I remembered." Ethan said nothing. Some moments don't survive being spoken. Ilara appeared at 4 in the afternoon, washed, dressed, her bag packed and sitting by the door. She moved carefully, the way people move when their body is still negotiating the cost of something recent. She found Lila at the kitchen table, and they looked at each other, the first time Lila had truly seen her, and neither spoke for a long moment. "Sit down," Lila said. "Not a question." Ilara sat. "Your father was the doctor on call. Prague, 12 years ago." Ilara's hands stilled. "Yes. He believed he could save my sight. He knew he could. The window was 8 hours. He'd spent 15 years building toward exactly that case. He saw my scans and he knew." Her voice stayed level, but it cost her. "And they told him no. Ethics board, administration. Too radical, unapproved. So he stood there with everything he needed and watched the window close." A pause. "He kept your file for 30 years. Every scan, every report from every specialist who touched you after. When Ethan Black's wife lost her sight in an accident, he already knew what the damage looked like before he read the reports. And then he died," Lila said. 6 months later, heart failure, officially." Ilara looked at her hands. "But I was there. I know what I watched. He survived the first time he couldn't save you. He didn't survive the second. A breath. He left me everything. All his research, 30 years of it. And a note that said, 'Finish what I couldn't. Find her. Make it right.'" The kitchen was very quiet. "How old were you?" 26. "And you've been working on this for 9 years. The formula needed refinement. He'd never been able to test it. There were gaps. Something shifted in her expression. You were also very difficult to find. You moved constantly." Despite everything, Lila almost smiled. "Ethan and his specialists. 6 cities in 18 months. I'm sorry, don't be." Ilara looked at her directly. "You're why I got up every morning. I'm not sorry for any of it." Ethan had been in the hallway. He knew it was becoming a habit. He stayed anyway. He heard all of it. The father with 15 years of preparation told to stand down, the 30-year file, the 6 months between "she needed me twice" and the death of a man who couldn't carry that anymore. The 9 years in an apartment in Bratislava, alone, working, refusing to let an unfinished thing stay unfinished. He stood there and was genuinely, permanently humbled. Not the performed humility of a powerful man making a gracious gesture. The real kind. The kind that moves through you quietly and leaves you rearranged. He'd spent 4 years and a staggering sum of money on the best minds in the world. He had refused the word impossible from everyone who offered it. And the thing that actually worked was a woman with a dead man's journals, 9 years of solitude, and a debt she felt to someone who didn't even know she existed. He walked into the kitchen. Ilara looked up without surprise. She had known, he suspected, that he was there. He sat across from her, looked at the bag by her door, looked at her. "You were going to leave without a conversation," he said. "My part is finished, is it?" He leaned forward. "What do you want, Ilara? Not what you think is appropriate. What do you actually want?" The question seemed to catch her completely off guard. As though 9 years of working toward this moment, she had never once considered what came after it. A long silence. "I don't know," she said finally. "That's a reasonable place to start." He stood and held out his hand. "Stay. Not as a caregiver, not as anything defined, just stay. Figure out the rest from here." She looked at his hand. Then at Lila, who was watching her with an expression that said the decision had already been made as far as she was concerned. Ilara took his hand. The painting was finished in 4 days. Lila worked like someone making up for lost time, which she was. It was the largest thing she'd ever made. 3 figures on a rooftop at sunset, in colors she'd held in memory for 4 years and found richer now for the keeping. The figure at the center had her face tilted upward, eyes open, wearing an expression Lila couldn't have painted before this week because she hadn't known it yet. The expression of someone who has earned the ability to see. They watched the sunset on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks later. The three of them on the rooftop as the sky went gold, then copper, then the deep, complicated red over the Hudson. Lila stood very still, the way she always did now, completely open to it, the posture of someone who has decided, once and permanently, never to take anything for granted again. She turned to Ilara. "He would have loved this," she said. "Your father." Ilara looked at the sky. "He would have complained about the methodology first." Lila laughed. Then she turned back to the sunset and looked at it with everything she had. The gold, the copper, the deep red she'd once named, the color of wanting something you almost had. She would need a new name for it now. "I used to think losing my sight was the end of me," she said quietly. "Now I think it was just an interruption." She tightened her hand in Ethan's. "A very long, very dark interruption. And this is what's on the other side." Nobody said anything. The sky went from red to purple, to the first deep blue of evening. Below them, the city lit up. Thousands of lights, all at once, the nightly miracle that most people stopped noticing after their first week here. Lila noticed. She would always notice. She had paid too much not to. The painting sold at her gallery opening 6 weeks later for a number that made the art world pay attention. She donated every cent to the Joseph Voss Research Initiative, a foundation she and Ilara built together, dedicated to finishing the work he'd started. Ilara's paper, submitted under both their names, entered clinical trials 2 years later. Dr. Joseph Voss's name was on the cover, as it should have been. Ethan gave a short speech at the opening. He hadn't planned to. He found himself standing in front of first light with a glass of wine, surrounded by people who wanted to talk about the painting, and instead he said this: "I spent 4 years learning what money cannot do. It turns out the list is longer and more important than the list of what it can. The greatest thing that ever happened to my family came with no price tag. It came with a worn leather journal, 9 years of quiet work, and a woman who believed that an unfinished thing deserved to be finished." He paused. "If you're somewhere dark right now, if you've heard impossible so many times you've started to believe it, I only want to say this: impossible is usually just not yet." He raised his glass. Nobody in the room knew quite what to say, but several of them cried, and that, as Lila told him later, walking home through the lit-up city, with her hand in his and Ilara a half-step behind them, was the whole point. To say something true enough that people feel it before they understand it. She would know. She was a painter, and she could see again. If this story found you today, if something in it landed somewhere real, maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe you needed to be reminded that the door you've been pushing against isn't locked forever. That the person who changes everything sometimes arrives with one bag, no explanation, and a quiet certainty that they're exactly where they're supposed to be. Maybe your miracle is already in the room.